He ate while laughing. He went to the bathroom while laughing. He actually slept, though fitfully, awaking every hour or so, laughing. For a few of my coworkers, he was the only fun part of their day. But he frightened me. This was probably because I was the new guy, the green psych tech who still thought he could make a difference in the world. Apparently, most psych techs, that is, psychiatric technicians, lose their compassion barometer after a while. And eventually, a patient who spends every waking moment laughing is no longer disturbing because he seems harmless. He terrified me also because, for some inexplicable reason, there was something familiar about him. To this day, my family still doesn't understand exactly what my role as a psych tech was. It's simple. Keep crazy people from hurting themselves or others. But what did I do all day on the job? Well, sometimes I sat in a chair watching some insane person lie on a bed in a small white room. And if they became agitated, I would lock the door. Sometimes I'd lead art hour, and we'd paint or make paper mache. No scissors allowed, of course. Sometimes I'd turn on a yoga video for exercise hour. And sometimes I pinned psychotic maniacs down, so my coworkers could apply the restraints and the nurses could inject 2 milligrams of lorazepam. I never got used to it. I kept caring. And that's why I only lasted a year. The laughing man laughed me right out of that acute psych ward. Allow me to explain. There isn't much that is funny about mental illness. And I don't mean to be insensitive or flippant about psychosis, about how it can rip the individual and their families apart. But to my fellow psych techs, many of them at least, it was all that these patients were. Psychos, crazies, maniacs. I tried to see them as people. They are people. And their illness isn't the only thing that defines them. But in the acute psych ward, their illness is in full swing. And it's the only side that psych techs like me saw of them. They were mostly bipolar patients in the height of their manic phase, or schizophrenics having a mental breakdown. The laughing guy, I'll call him Aaron, was a schizophrenic in his early 50s, with an atypical form of catatonia. Most catatonic schizophrenics will sit motionless, staring off for days without eating or sleeping. I recall one patient there who would stand in the middle of a room, maintaining an impossible pose for several days. When his catatonia subsided, this patient explained that during those frozen moments, he fully believed that if he moved, the world would end. But as in Aaron's case, his psychiatrist explained it to me. Some catatonics don't remain motionless, but have repetitive, purposeless motions or actions. And Aaron's catatonic expression was laughing, non-stop. Aaron had been in and out of the psych ward for years, alternating between the state mental hospital and the local hospital, for there were some legal stipulations that didn't allow him to stay in a long-term facility. Later, I found out it was because no facility could handle his laughing for more than a few months at a time. When I started my job, Aaron had already been in this psych ward for 3 months. But, according to some of the seasoned psych techs, he had been laughing like this for 10 years. Like I mentioned, most psych techs found him amusing. And more than once I saw a tech putting his arm around Aaron, laughing with him, mocking the way his high-pitched, almost screeching laugh nervously drowned out any conversation in the room. But Aaron took no notice to them when they did this. His eyes looked straight through anyone who faced him, and he kept pacing in place when a tech tried to hold him, like there was some motor inside of him that never shut off. He paced like this all day, and to get him to eat, I'd have to pace with him, placing bits of food in his mouth as we went. We scheduled bathroom breaks for him every hour or so we didn't have to change his clothes, and this worked 50% of the time. All the while, he laughed his piercing, frantic laugh. It grated on me. Only after a week of being there, I dreaded going up those elevators, greeted by his incessant laugh as I entered that dismal psych ward. Aaron wasn't the most frightening patient I've had there that year. Oh, the stories I could tell. But perhaps the strangest, maybe even the most tragic, certainly the most personal. I understood that most catatonics had progressive worsening schizophrenia until they just shut off. But it killed me to know why this guy just started laughing and nobody knew why. Before I quit, I asked nearly everyone about his story and no one knew. Until I met Dr. Greenwald, an ancient psychiatrist who hadn't worked at the psych ward in years. I heard stories of this doctor, and from what I gathered, he was a kind, highly esteemed man who loved what he did, who didn't judge these tormented patients. Dr. Greenwald was probably my strongest inspiration for becoming a physician myself. And to this day, I remember the compassion he showed towards patients. The older nurses loved him, and when they found out that he was taking a break from his private outpatient practice to round occasionally in the acute psych ward, they were all thrilled. Meeting Dr. Greenwald actually exceeded my expectations, and I admired how he valued every interaction, genuinely caring about each person in front of him, even lowly psych techs like me. One night, a few weeks before I quit, I saw Dr. Greenwald exiting Aaron's room after his evaluation, and I had the feeling he would have answers about Aaron, answers about how he came to be the way he was. Graciously, he told me, the first time Dr. Greenwald met Aaron in the hospital, he recognized a few things. Aaron was a good-natured, caring guy who, not surprisingly, loved to laugh and make others laugh. Dr. Greenwald remembered him capturing audiences, telling the most hilarious stories that would have the whole room in fits. He hadn't had an easy life, but he weathered his burdens well, easily laughing at life's ironies, both large and small. Dr. Greenwald was unaware of any previous psychiatric history, though Aaron had married a beautiful woman who suffered from lifelong depression and anxiety. Because Aaron had such a strong desire to care for troubled people, these feelings drew him to his wife. Aaron wanted to fix her, and through it all, he fell in love with her. She quickly became pregnant after they married, and in time, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Her mental illness worsened after the birth, thought to be postpartum depression, and Aaron became nearly obsessed with the study of psychology. Despite his efforts to fix her, she deteriorated, developing postpartum psychosis, and she began hearing voices, telling her to do violent things. Everything changed when Aaron found out his wife had killed his infant son. Upon hearing this, Aaron started to laugh, and he never stopped. After Dr. Greenwald finished his story, I sat there speechless, though not in silence, as Aaron's shrill laugh emanated from his hospital room. Dr. Greenwald sat there with me, and I caught a glimpse of emotion on his face. "Isn't it odd?" I finally said. "That he broke completely all of a sudden. I thought most catatonics have a long history of schizophrenia or something." I felt like an idiot as soon as my words left my mouth. Certainly, Aaron had some mental disorder to have been a patient of Dr. Greenwald's. Dr. Greenwald smiled at me like a loving grandfather. Some things are just too much for a human mind to handle. I guess that something so tragic could make just about anybody snap. What was his diagnosis when you met him, sir? I asked. He looked at me puzzled. What do you mean? When you met him, what were you treating him for? Son, he wasn't my patient. He paused. Aaron was a psych tech here. I worked with him for years. I was here the day his wife was brought in, strapped to a stretcher, blood covering her face and clothing. She was completely psychotic, deranged, uncontrollable. Aaron was working here that day. I gaped at him, my mouth wide open, and all I managed to squeak out was a bewildered, "What?" Dr. Greenwald sighed heavily. I imagine that Aaron knew he was about to lose his mind then. And suddenly he became what he tried so hard to fix. The irony was, I guess, too much. So he just had to laugh. Dr. Greenwald stood up and patted me on the shoulder. He had stayed much longer than he expected to, and I slowly stood up watching him walk away. As he exited the secured door, he turned to me and said, Strangely, you remind me of him. Before he, started laughing. You care a lot about these people, I can tell. They're lucky to have you. Mortified, it suddenly washed over me, the realization nearly drowning me. There was something so intimate and familiar about Aaron, and I could never explain it to even myself how I saw a piece of me in that lifeless shell of a man, that laughing, insane man. I had no response for Dr. Greenwald in that moment, but bursting from my lungs came a terrifying, totally involuntary laugh. I turned in my resignation notice that same day. When people experience certain events in their life, they are often changed. Their habits, their mannerisms, their personalities can all be supplanted. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Many of you out there have heard my story and know that I narrowly escaped with my life that day. However, that day wasn't the end of my story. It felt like it was only just the beginning. Ever since I encountered that creature behind that Walmart, my life has been affected. Every night after getting off of work and driving home, I'd feel like I was being watched. Stalked would be more like it. That feeling would last all throughout the night. From the moment I stepped out of my office in the evening to the minute the sun rose on the horizon was nerve-wracking. The feeling was like having someone walk next to you in public, only their head and eyes were fixed upon you. Never blinking, never turning away, and never stopping. At least, not until the sun comes up. Ever since that day, I've become somewhat of an obsessive morning person. I used to dread opening my eyes and having to drag my heavy body out of bed. I hated it with a passion, hence why I chose to work the night shift. But now, when those rays of light touch my eyelids, I feel renewed, happy, but most importantly, I felt safe. Throughout the day, my life continued on normally. I'd wake up, shower, have some coffee, drive to work, eat lunch, go back to work, and then drive home. While my job was in no means a fun place to work, it was the only time in my life where I didn't have an uneasy feeling hanging over me. It wasn't long after starting my new job that the nightmares began to occur. They started small at first, then became worse over time. The first nightmares played out like this. I'd be walking down the street, see the figure in the distance, then immediately wake up. But as time went on, my nightmares became more intense. Being in an endless Walmart, running to an exit that doesn't exist, and whenever I turn around, that thing would be mere inches away from me. Now, the only nightmares I have are me sitting alone in a pitch black room, my eyes trying to strain in the darkness. I'd blink, then its face would be right in front of mine. Its pale eyes staring at me, like two dim clouds in the sky. Its cracked mouth oozing more of that black liquid. Then, in a flash, it would grab my face and I'd wake back up. It was quickly becoming something I could no longer stand anymore. I tried sleeping pills, dream suppressants, caffeine. Nothing seemed to be of any help. Suffering through this for months, I found I only had two options left. Either go talk to a professional or put myself out of my misery. I chose the former. The psychologist I ended up meeting was not what I expected. Most I've seen on TV are the Mr. Rogers type, all touchy-feely. This doctor was none of that. He was a large, bearded man who felt very intimidating to me. But he listened to my problems and provided some decent advice. I never realized how much help simply talking about my situation would be. It was like a weight had been lifted off of my chest. The constant nightmares or the sense of being followed home actually diminished somewhat, and I thought I might actually be onto something here. At first, I was reluctant to tell him about this creature that plagued me. I didn't want a quick trip to a padded cell, but he quickly became aware that I was hiding something, and through carefully crafted questions got me to reveal my experience that night. After a few sessions of addressing this creature and how it made me feel, the doctor came to the conclusion that I needed to confront my demons, as it were. He told me that if I go back and face my fears head on, that I'll truly see that there is nothing to be afraid of, and my subconscious will slowly begin to accept that fact, ultimately repairing itself. I wasn't convinced. But so far, this doctor hasn't led me astray, and I trusted him. So if this was the best course of action, I'd at least try it. Some of you might consider this foolish or me ignorant, but I was at the end of my rope here, seeking help in any form. And if this guy said it'll help me, then I believed him. I had to. It took me almost another month to work up the courage to go back to that Walmart. Eventually, my doctor suggested I go during the day and simply walk around. Since I felt fine during the day, I thought it was a fair idea. I took a day off from work and drove to the Walmart, and sat in the parking lot for an hour. I parked in a spot adjacent to the back area of the building. It looked as normal as any other loading area should. That particular Walmart actually backed up to a small wooded creek. The looming trees added a sense of enclosure to the whole area. Finally, I exited my car and walked around the back. The same dumpster was there, and even one of the trailers was parked in the same spot. Whether it was the same trailer from before, I couldn't say. I meandered around for a bit, carefully scanning the trees and the building itself. It was strange to me that every single night since the encounter, I had felt nothing but fear. But each and every day when the sun was out, I felt nothing but calm serenity, like a fish being caught, only to be released back into the water. After an uneventful hour, I decided it was finally time to head home. Actually, experiencing the Walmart during the day gave me an overwhelming confidence boost. As soon as I got home, I phoned my doctor and told him the results. He was happy for me and asked if I'd be willing to go back at night. I shuddered at the idea, but if I could once and for all prove to myself that it wasn't real, I'd be willing to take the chance. It ended up taking me 2 more days before I finally worked up the nerve to go through with it. I arrived earlier in the day and watched as the sun slowly set through my rearview mirror. I tried doing what my psychologist told me to do and repeat to myself that it was all in my mind, which actually made me feel a little bit better. Soon, the vehicles around me began to dwindle, and before long, only mine and a few other late-night patrons filled the parking lot. After repeating myself non-stop for another hour, I almost started to actually convince myself that I just had an episode and there was nothing out there. I got out of my car and walked around the building. There were 2 large truck trailers attached to the wall. The same dumpster resided not that far away. Everything was completely quiet, aside from the occasional echo of a cart being pushed from the other side of the building. I started scanning my surroundings, but nothing was amiss. Just as I glanced over the woods, I heard something. The snapping of a twig. Hearing this nearly made me jump out of my skin. My eyes darted along the tree line in the direction of the sound. I couldn't see anything, but that didn't stop my heart from pounding rapidly in my chest. I finally decided that this was good enough, that I was convinced it was all in my head. I sighed deeply before beginning my walk back to my car. But before I could even take my first step, I heard something behind me. It was a footstep. Slowly, I felt my body involuntarily turn towards the noise. My face drained of color as I realized I was face to face with that creature. It had somehow appeared directly behind me out of thin air. Its jaw hung loosely as if it were unhinged. A wheeze-like noise emanated from it as the black sludge poured out of its mouth. Its pale, cloudy eyes seemed to dart rapidly inside its misshapen skull, as if it were studying every inch of my face. Then, in one motion, its face began to rise. It kept its eyes locked upon mine as it straightened out its bony legs. The creature was taller than I remembered it being. I shut my eyes and repeated my mantra. It wasn't real. It wasn't happening. After a few minutes of this, my fear started to subside, and my confidence started to grow. Suddenly, I felt a large, thin hand wrap itself around my throat. In that moment, I felt my confidence shatter and my fear consume me. My eyes shot open in a panic, and I wrapped my hand around the wrist of the emaciated hand that gripped my throat. I felt my feet leave the ground as the thing lifted me by my neck. It lowered its face to mine once more, and opened its mouth. Its lower jaw extended like a snake's. Inside its gaping maw, I could see rows of slimy black, sharp teeth. I felt like it wanted to swallow me whole. I began to flail wildly in my attempt to free myself from its grasp. I managed to land a kick on the creature's torso, which in turn caused it to drop me. I felt my shoulder pop as I landed hard on it from that height. The monster bellowed as it steadied itself. By that point, I was sprinting to my car, but I wasn't as lucky this time. Its long fingers gripped at my jacket, tearing into it, causing me to faceplant. The taste of iron stung the back of my throat as I felt blood pool in my mouth. I turned over to see it grabbing onto my leg and attempting to drag me back into the woods. I kicked at its arm, but it was no use. Its grip on my leg felt like it was going to snap it. My hand then rested upon a large chunk of asphalt. Quickly grabbing it, I spun around and caught the creature in the side of the head with it. It reared back, dropping me in the process. I scrambled to my car, got in, and drove out of there, not stopping until I was safely inside my own house. It's been almost a month since that night. I've now become a recluse. Thanks to the times, I can eat, sleep, and work all from the safety of my own home. My nightmares are still an issue, but I found if I drowned myself in enough alcohol, I'd sleep soundly through the night. I contacted my doctor, thanking him for his time, and canceled all my future appointments. Because whenever I look at my torn jacket, hanging on my coat rack, I'm reminded that it wasn't all in my head after all. So if you plan on going out after dark, and you find yourself wandering behind buildings where you shouldn't be, just be careful. You might not be as lucky as I was. The deathbed story my grandfather told was not one I initially believed. He had been in a car accident. There was head trauma. He was in and out of consciousness for a few days before an aneurysm took him out of this world. During his moments of lucidity, he talked to me. It didn't make a lot of sense. The doctor told me everything Grandpa said following the crash could be explained by brain damage, and I agreed. It seemed like he was conflating the old scary stories that he used to tell me as a kid with real events from his past. The real event went like this. In 1980, he was patrolling Canyon del Cristo, a spot in the Mojave that had, over the years, become a place where drug cartels went to dump bodies. Despite no bodies turning up in over 20 months, he still liked to give it a walkthrough every now and then. Nice scenery and good air, he'd claim, aside from when I'd find a body. His trouble started when a rattlesnake startled him, causing him to jump back and lose his footing. It was a bad spot for that. He ended up falling about 8 feet and shattering his knee. That part I already knew. I had vague memories of him in a cast when I was young. He was on the canyon floor for hours. Whenever he tried to move, the pain was so intense he'd just stop and scream. There was nothing he could do. His radio was out of reach. There were no cell phones back then. It was only a matter of time before a mountain lion came by and put an end to him. It turned out mountain lions were the least of his worries. Storm clouds were gathering overhead. Canyon del Cristo was known for its flash floods. If the rain was anything more than a sprinkle, he'd drown. It was much more than a sprinkle. As thunder roared and rain pedaled his supine body, he waited for the inevitable flood that would end his life. I knew this part too. According to his previous versions of the story, a patrol car came by after he hadn't been making his routine radio check-ins. The other officer got him out of the canyon just before he was buried in the mud and the floodwater. He brought him to the hospital, got a cast, and recovered for a few months. The end. But recently, as he lay dying, my grandfather insisted that wasn't what really happened. Grandpa said he was panicking and hyperventilating in the dirt, which caused him to pass out. When he came to, he was in what looked like a shallow cave in the side of the canyon. And there were people in there with him. Now, I need to pause to tell you all about the scary stories my grandfather told me when I was a kid. He used to talk about creepy children with tiny eyes who wandered around the Mojave and kidnapped other children. I always thought it was a way for him to scare me away from going into the desert by myself. And it worked. The way he described those kids, their fat, pale faces, bald heads, huge, toothless mouths, and pinprick-sized red eyes, gave me nightmares for years. And it certainly kept me away from the desert, that's for sure. Decades later, as I listened to the story from his deathbed, Grandpa recalled waking up in the cave with two of those creatures from his scary stories. I screamed when I saw them, he said. They were so awful looking. So wrong. Oh yeah? What did they do? I asked, regretting the unveiled skepticism in my voice. They turned around and stared at me, he replied. Their mouths were wide open. I thought they were going to eat me alive, but they didn't, obviously. There was a dead coyote on the floor. One of them shoved the whole thing into its mouth. Fur and all? I inquired. Fur and all. It closed its mouth and sort of shook. Then it opened up again and spit what looked like half the coyote into the mouth of its friend. It was like ground meat with bits of fur and bone in it. I just kept screaming. One of them came over and put its hand on my busted knee. It hurt more than anything. I was yelling and hollering and praying I'd pass out again. Whatever they were going to do to me, I didn't want to be conscious for it. Before I knew it, I heard shots. It was a sheriff and a ranger. They had been looking for me. They filled those bastards with more holes than I had seen since the war. After that, they dragged me out of the cave and brought me to the hospital. The rest is history. I studied my grandfather with pity. Like I said, I figured he was combining the trauma from his fall with the scary stories he told me when I was a kid. I didn't give it much thought. I smiled and nodded and patronized the poor guy until he passed away a few days later. In his will, I was given his home. I moved into his desert ranch 6 months ago with my wife and newborn daughter. It didn't take long before I realized my grandfather had been telling the truth. It started with footprints in the dust outside the front and back doors. They weren't ones I recognized. They appeared to be 3 long, fat toes connected to stumpy feet. A little while later, the same footprints were showing up around the windows, especially the ones overlooking the baby's room. Our little Paige. I bought a rifle that same afternoon. I called the police to notify them, and they assured me that they'd send regular patrols around. They didn't seem surprised by the footprints, and they asked, unprompted, if a newborn lived at the house. Just to make sure the windows are locked, I was told. A good lock should keep out most would-be intruders. Besides, if someone breaks in, you're well within your rights to use your weapon. Feel free to set up some security cameras too. They're pretty cheap nowadays. I took their advice. The footprints didn't show up again. When I scanned through the camera footage, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Things were quiet for a while. 3 days ago, my wife had gone to the store. I was home alone watching Paige, who was asleep in her crib. It was around noon. I heard the screen door open and commented, "That was fast." My wife had left for the store only 20 minutes ago, and it took 10 minutes just to get there. She didn't respond. I figured she had just forgotten something. Paige began to scream. "What's wrong, Paige?" I called. "Hey, Erica, can you go check on her?" There was no reply. And Paige continued to scream. "Erica?" I got off the couch and headed down the hall. There was a bizarre, musty smell in the house, almost like Erica had stepped in something when she was outside. "Calm down, Paige, I'll be right there." The screaming grew muffled, as if she had found her pacifier. "See?" I said, turning around the corner into her room. "There's nothing to scream about." I froze in my tracks. Something was holding Paige, with its long, pink fingers. It was short and stout, with a bald head and a massive, gaping maw, and small red eyes. "Drop her!" I screamed, rushing at the thing. It was lifting my daughter to its mouth. I grabbed onto my baby, shoving the creature hard, and it freed her. Her screams began anew. I clutched her to my chest and backed away, my eyes never leaving the monster in front of me. Its red eyes glared at me. Something was happening to its face. Slits were opening in a circle from its cheeks to its forehead. I kept moving. I was heading for the gun safe in the master bedroom. The slits stopped once they looked like wide gashes encircling each of its tiny eyes. It walked out of the room towards us, with its arms outstretched, its fingers elongated. "Get out!" I yelled. "Get out of my house!" The flesh around the slits lifted. I stared with disbelief as what was underneath came into view. It was a cluster of countless red eyes. They bulged outward like swollen cranberries as it strode towards us, its hideous mouth gasping and gurgling with every shuffling step. I reached the bedroom and slammed the door. I placed Paige on the bed. I could hear long fingers scraping at the door. I tried to unlock the gun safe. The combination was taking forever. I couldn't remember if it was our anniversary or Erica's birthday. And I couldn't remember if I even had those dates right. I was panicking. By the time I got the gun out, the scraping had stopped. I burst out of the bedroom, gun at the ready. But the creature was gone. The screen door was open. Large three-toed footprints went out into the desert. I called 911 and the emergency services came. I gave them our security camera footage and they're in the process of investigating. Paige spent the night in the hospital, but they said she'll be okay. The police told the doctors there was no need to call CPS. The cops know what's going on. I know they do. I also know we can't stay at that house anymore. Not while Paige is a baby, and, if possible, not after that either. Over the last couple of days, nothing has tried to enter our home. Erica and I are looking at real estate options in the city, while police cars are a regular feature on the street outside. Things have been quiet. I was praying I'd scared the things away for good. I almost believed I had. Until I found face prints on Paige's window earlier this morning. And marks from long, greasy fingers right next to it. My normal shifts were during the day, 9 to 5 like most people. But on that day, we were short-handed on the night shift staff, because the last person who worked during those hours had just quit. We've been having a lot of people quit the night shift lately, so that meant I had to cover. Weirdly enough, I had never worked the graveyard shift before then, and I was actually kind of excited for it. I brought some coffee and a 5-hour energy with me because the hours ran from 10 to 5 a.m., and there was no way I'd make it that far naturally. I got to my tower right before 10 p.m., when it was already pitch black out, and the cold summer night had fully set in. The tower was fairly tall, with several flights of stairs leading up to the top. The entire thing was mostly surrounded by thick forests, except for the trail that I came in from, and a murky pond that was just to the right of one of the tower's legs. The pond itself was covered in those little lily pads, and had algae floating around the surface. It was actually somewhat large for a natural lagoon. I climbed up and all I could hear was the non-stop sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional owl. When I hit the top, I fumbled with my keys until I finally found the right one and went inside. The singular room was small and square-shaped. 3 of the walls were mostly glass, and the other one was opaque and had the door that I just walked through. The roof went up like a pyramid for a short length until it peaked, and it was completely made out of wood. To my left was a nicely made bed, and a nightstand with a lamp and a flashlight on top. Not like I'd be using the bed, though. On the wall next to that was my CB radio and communication stand. which every one of those towers had. Next to that sat my refrigerator and microwave, which was part of a small kitchen that extended to the other wall as well. Inside the kitchen section on the right wall were several cabinets. Some were small ones that held snacks and some canned foods, and another set of large cabinets that I couldn't open for some reason, which likely had vacuums and other cleaning supplies that were above my pay grade. Overall, the tower was roomy. I went over to the communication stand and did my standard check to make sure everything was working properly. I called into the ranger station channel and said, "Well, Donnie, it looks like it's just you and me tonight." Donnie didn't say anything back, so I figured he was just using the bathroom. I went and grabbed the flashlight on the stand and reached into one of its drawers, pulling out a set of binoculars from it. I made my way out onto the balcony and checked to make sure there were no fire hazards or any other kind of dangerous things over there. Once I checked that box off of my to-do list, I headed back inside and pulled out the chair from the communication stand and put it by one of the glass walls. I grabbed a granola bar from one of the kitchen cabinets to munch on. I sat down and put the binoculars up to my eyes and looked over the surrounding forest. It didn't seem like any animals were up and about, and no birds were in the sky either. I skimmed over a couple of clearings to make sure that no teenagers were off camping illegally. Then I went and peeked over at the far ridge, where I saw a snowman standing alone in the gap of the trees. Wait a second. It was summer. I turned back again to see it wasn't a snowman, but some kid in a ghost costume. It looked like the ones from Charlie Brown, with the big black holes for eyes that looked more like they were colored black than actually holes. The kid was still, and was staring right into my direction, unmoving. I couldn't see the kid's parents anywhere, and by now it was rolling up on 11 o'clock, so that meant something was off. I broke contact with the kid and walked over to the radio, calling into the station. "Donnie, you out of the bathroom yet?"
Barely made it out, but I'm here.
I chuckled. Donnie was always good for a laugh. "Hey, there's some kid with a blanket walking around in the southeast sector. They look alone."
A blanket? What the hell are you talking about?
"I think it's a costume. It's one of those ghost things. It's got black holes for eyes and stuff."
You mean like Charlie Brown?
"Yeah, can you check it out?"
Alright, I'll go check it out. I'll call in on the walkie-talkie to tell you what I see.
"Alright, copy that." I turned off the radio and crossed over to the nightstand, grabbing the walkie-talkie. Once I had it, I sat back down on the chair and put the binoculars up to my eyes, zooming in to where the kid was. The ridge was empty. No kid in sight, which I knew would make this 1,000 times harder. I pulled up the antenna on the walkie-talkie and dialed to the right channel. "Donnie, you hear me?"
Yeah, I hear ya. I'm getting close to the sector now. I'm heading up to a ridge for a vantage point.
"Perfect, that's where I saw the kid. But I think they have moved since then."
Well, I'll just check around and see if I can find anything.
I watched as Donnie came over the ridge waving his flashlight around in the dark, until he looked towards the tower and shrugged.
Nothing over here.
Damn, hopefully he turns up again. Until then, I'll just notify the police and check with any missing reports.
Alright, I'll go back to...
Donnie's voice cut out and I saw his flashlight turn off in the distance. The small illuminated spot where he stood was swallowed by darkness. "Donnie? You there?" I heard no response. I rushed outside the door and around the corner to where I saw him. I hollered his name only to hear my voice echo back from the woods. And that's when it hit me. There wasn't a single other sound in the entire forest. The crickets and frogs had stopped chirping and croaking. The wind didn't rustle through the leaves. Everything was at a standstill. I could hear my heartbeat throbbing in my ears and nothing else. I moved my flashlight around the woods in some futile attempt to find him. I was getting into that state of mind where I was so nervous that my throat started to close up, and if I moved, I felt like something very bad would happen. I had to do something. I turned around, and as I did, I glanced at the stairs below me. At the very bottom stood a skinny, horrifically angled woman. She was tall, dripping with water, with black hair and dark, murky blue skin that stretched across her bent and broken bones. Her gray dress was shredded, and her black shoes were muddy and wet. And her face, her eyes were milky white, and her mouth hung open like a snake, like her jaw had been grossly broken. She let out a blood-curdling and ear-piercing scream of agony and began to shuffle up the stairs fast. When I saw this, I snapped out of my fear, and I ran back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. There was no way she could run that fast, even if all of her bones weren't broken in the wrong directions. I ran back into the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find. And then I pulled out the walkie-talkie again, screaming into it. "Donnie, where are you? Is anybody there?" Then, I heard the creaking of a door. I slowly turned, and I froze when I saw what was there. The door to the tower was still there, locked and shut, and had been completely undisturbed. What scared me was the giant cabinet that now stood open, with a kid dressed like a Charlie Brown ghost standing just in front of it. I stood there, unmoving until I heard him giggle. I recognized that giggle. I grabbed the sheet and ripped it off of one of Donnie's kids, Marvin, sporting a smirk and a walkie-talkie. "Dad, Joey, I got him."
Ha ha ha! Pissed his pants just like I said he would, right?
Donnie and his other son laughed from the other side of the walkie. I was mad, but glad that I wasn't about to get murdered in this tower. I grabbed his walkie-talkie and fired back. More like pissed me off is what you did. I hope you're happy.
Hearing you scream like a little girl sure did make me happy.
Yeah, screw you too, buddy. That wasn't even me. That was your stupid zombie chick. Who was that, your wife?
My what? Does the ghost look like a zombie from that far away? You said it yourself, it looked like Charlie Brown.
Not the ghost, man. The woman on the stairs. She screamed and ran up them so that she could scare me into the tower. Hell, she must have been an Olympic runner.
Yeah, I didn't put any woman on the stairs.
Upon hearing that, I quit the next morning, and I vowed never to return to that forest again. Let me take another drink before I get started. It'll most likely be my last. I'm never going to leave this place. I've been in this room for hours typing this story, and I need it to be told. I keep trying to finish, but sometimes I feel like my mind is slipping. I'm posting my story here for one simple reason. I don't have access to a phone, and any calls for help have gone unanswered. I can't trust anyone here. They're gonna kill me. I'm gonna start from the beginning. The first time I had ever heard of the Lionheart Chateau. My wife convinced me to come home early from work, eager to share some exciting news. She was beaming when I entered the front door and handed me a pamphlet. She went on to explain that a few months ago she had entered a contest and won an all-inclusive weekend at a luxurious bed and breakfast, boasting about how they do not market like other businesses. No website, billboards, signs, or even commercials. Free and all-inclusive was all that I needed to hear. Even though she was 9 months pregnant, my wife convinced me we needed the mini vacation. She assured me that there was a great hospital close enough just in case. I'm embarrassed to admit I'm not sure of the exact location of the Lionheart Chateau. Our home is in New York City, and my wife mentioned the chateau was upstate. Even though I drove most of the way, my mind was focused on my wife. The way the baby has been kicking during this past trimester has made it very hard on her. I woke her up just as we were pulling up to the large colonial building, buried deep within the woods. That part I remember distinctly. The driveway, the long winding road that led us here. But the rest of the journey feels like a dream. I need to finish the details while I still remember them. As we were about to get out of the car, my wife suggested that we leave our phones locked in the center console. I laughed at first, but then I saw how serious she was. I have always been bad about my phone. I am constantly distracted by it. She went on to tell me that she wanted this weekend to be about us and not about technology. I couldn't find a reason to argue with her, so I just kept my phone in the car. I didn't tell her about the laptop packed in my suitcase, though. I was impressed from the moment we arrived. The building itself was gorgeous, a massive mansion fit for the elite. The staff was courteous, racing up to our car to help us right away. The weekend was truly about my wife and we were the only customers in the entire chateau. The staff catered to our every need. I almost felt like I was royalty or on a luxurious cruise. I had little to complain about, and I was honestly enjoying myself. The first oddity occurred on Saturday evening. My wife retired to bed early, and I decided to head to the bar. Every staff member I encountered said the same exact thing to me. We are truly blessed to have you and your wife in our presence. What I think I found odd is how they said it. I worked retail jobs in the past, but these people were ecstatic that we were here. Each compliment felt genuine, like we were celebrities and they had waited their entire lives to meet us. Everywhere I went, I felt their eyes upon me, always smiling and ready to serve. After a few glasses of red wine, I got up and searched for a bathroom. I made my way down a flight of stairs near the bar, and that's when I heard it. A low humming coming from one of the basement rooms. The noise was melodic and followed by faint whispers. I crept closer to the door that was slightly ajar and peered inside. I discovered the source of the humming and the whispers. About 10 staff members dressed up in white robes. They were on their hands and knees and appeared to be praying to something in the corner. As soon as they saw me, a woman rushed to the door and slammed it shut in my face. I never saw what they were praying to. I went back to our room ready to tell my wife what I saw. I remember feeling dizzy after the walk upstairs, even though I only had a few glasses of their wine. I climbed into bed trying to shake it off. I woke up feeling extremely groggy and confused. Everything from the previous night seemed like a bad dream. I looked up at the clock in disbelief. It was 3 p.m. I have no idea how I could have possibly slept that long. Even more concerning, my wife was not in the room. Although she's never happy when I oversleep, she always wakes me up anyway. I got dressed, went downstairs, and began to search for her. Not only could I not find my wife, I couldn't find anyone. I was completely alone. The halls of the chateau suddenly didn't feel so inviting. I decided to head outside and search the grounds, and grab my phone out of my car. That's when I discovered all the doors had been chained and locked shut. All of the windows of the chateau were either too small to fit through or too high to reach. It was like everything and everyone had simply vanished. I was starting to panic when I realized I hadn't searched the basement yet. As I raced down the flight of stairs, adrenaline coursed through me. I heard a noise that I feared the most. The sound of my wife screaming. I sprinted to the door to where the staff was worshiping last night, and her cries of pain only grew louder as I approached. I pounded on the door as hard as I could. To my surprise, it was open from the other side. 3 large men in the same white robes stood in front of me. Before I could fight back, it was already over. I was held down by 2 as the other one pulled out a large syringe from his pocket. A sharp pain shot through my shoulder and I quickly lost consciousness. I woke up back in my room, what I assume was hours later. I ran over to the door. Just as I feared, it wouldn't budge. My suitcase was open and all my belongings were strewn across the room. Somebody had gone through it all, presumably to search for phones and weapons. The only thing I knew they wouldn't find was my laptop. I had placed it in the gap underneath a large dresser in the corner of our room, a habit I had gotten into ever since I had one stolen from me at a hotel. Luckily, it was still there. As I was attempting to log into my email to send for help, the TV in the room turned on. I looked at the screen in horror. It was my wife. She was sitting in the basement room, surrounded by the staff. There was a large golden statue behind her, depicting a man's body with a lion's head, brandishing a butcher's knife. She too was wearing the same white robe and holding a newborn child. Our child. She and the rest smiled intently into the camera as she spoke. You would never understand, so I never bothered explaining. Our child has been chosen. We are truly blessed to have him in our presence. But I fear you have done your job and your journey is now over. Just outside your room, in the courtyard, we are preparing your glorious departure from this world. Goodbye, dear husband. We love you. The screen faded to black. I buried my face in my hands as I tried to comprehend what I had just seen and heard. Then I remember what she said and ran over to the window to look out to the courtyard. I saw them all. Dozens of them, all in white robes, building what I can only describe as a funeral pyre. So, I'm sending this out to the world. I hope that it's received somewhere out there, begging you that if it's too late for me, then this is a warning. Whatever you do, do not stay at the Lionheart Chateau. I've decided that it must be one or the other. How else could I explain seeing the same exact person everywhere I went? He is impossible not to notice with his long gray mustache waxed to a point, bushy eyebrows caught in a perpetual explosion, floppy white hair that looked like it was having an argument with his head. He doesn't always speak to me, or even look at me. But for the last 2 years, he's always been there. He first appeared as a substitute teacher when I was in my junior year of high school. He introduced himself as Mr. Bryce, although there was a long hesitation before he gave his name, as though he couldn't decide what he wanted to be called. His voice wasn't right either. I remember him spending half the class switching accents, his speech collapsing occasionally into a variety of foreign languages before he caught himself and readjusted. The class found him dapper and charming in his fine tailored wool suit, and I didn't initially suspect him of anything more than being eccentrically addled. The next day, he was working in the cafeteria. Substitutes go where they're needed, I suppose, but oddly, none of my classmates seemed to remember him. They remembered that we had a substitute teacher, sure, but everyone was quite sure that it wasn't him. He gave me an extra scoop of chili and winked at me, muttering in an English accent, "I won't tell if you don't." I don't think he was talking about the chili. Mr. Bryce spent the next few weeks rotating throughout the school. One day he was a janitor. Next, he was a guest speaker, or even the principal himself. I quickly learned to stop bringing up the phenomenon when it became obvious that I was the only one who noticed. Mr. Bryce was learning too. It didn't take long before his speech stopped fluctuating and his clothes adapted to nondescript khakis and a polo shirt. I tried questioning him more than once, but the man stubbornly adhered to the role he had assumed, pretending he knew me only as well as the character he played. At the same time, there would always be little winks or enigmatic phrases thrown in which conveyed our peculiar intimacy. I caught him one day alone, when I had forgotten my calculator and had to double back for it. Mr. Bryce was on the phone, casually reclining with his feet flung up on his desk. I distinctly remember the words. "Of course he caught on, but he isn't frightened yet." He winked again when he met my eye. I stood in abject confusion while he politely disengaged from his phone call. "Were you talking about me?" I asked. The feet came down with a stomp. "All the time," he said, leaning forward to fold his well-manicured hands on his desk. He cocked his head to the side, studying me intensely. "You preoccupy most of my time nowadays. But I mustn't get too attached to you." The hell is that supposed to mean? "You don't belong here." He coughed, then the infuriating wink. "What I mean to say is, the teachers can't go home until the last student leaves. So, run along." I snatched my calculator without another word. The whole situation was so unnerving, and I couldn't think of anything to respond. Mr. Bryce blatantly picked up his phone again as I left. "He's just leaving. No, I don't think he'll run yet. Where could he possibly go that I wouldn't find him?" I didn't see him at school much after that, but he was always somewhere, always watching me. On a bench reading the newspaper, or bussing tables, or working behind the counter at a gas station. I never confronted him, although I did try taking a picture of him a few times. The pictures would work, but only for a day. When I looked back at the photo after that, everything else would be the same except for Mr. Bryce, who would invariably be replaced with the real person. The same person that everyone else remembered being there the whole time. Like he said, I wasn't afraid yet though. The situation enthralled me for a few weeks, but after that it simply became part of life. And as long as Mr. Bryce was there, my life was being steered in a particular direction. Mr. Bryce, the school counselor, took the liberty of submitting my applications to a science program at Stanford University, where he felt I would excel. Mr. Bryce, the college administrator, overlooked my mediocre grades in favor of my exceptional essay, which I never remember writing. Mr. Bryce, the restaurant manager, fired me when I mentioned wanting to wait a bit on college. He said he didn't want my life here interfering with my future opportunities. I almost hit him when he winked at me that time. More than all his other meddling, that one really got me. I was fired right on the spot in the middle of my shift with 2 coworkers watching. I just felt so angry and helpless and alone. I wanted to scream at him and tell him that I won't play his games anymore, but that would just make me look like the crazy one. I wanted to tell him that he didn't control my life, and that I wasn't afraid of him. But of course, he already knew that to be a lie. "Go. Quietly now, won't you?" he said. "You don't want an incident on your record." Why not? I was conscious of all the eyes on me, but I had to say something. Since when has anything I've done made a difference? "Oh, but it can. Not to you, maybe. But I'd hate to think of how other people might be affected by your stupidity." "Are you threatening me?" I said it loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. 5 seconds of silence can feel like a very long time, and I gloated the whole while. He wasn't embarrassed or defensive like I thought he would be, though. He glanced dispassionately at the surrounding patronage before taking 2 long strides towards me, close enough for me to feel his breath on my face. "Yes, I'll threaten you, if that's what it takes." I hadn't expected that. Neither had anyone else around us. One of the waitresses made a nervous giggle, but it was cut unnaturally short. "I'm doing this for your own good," Mr. Bryce added. "Don't test me." We stared off for a moment before his phone started ringing. "You're a piece of shit, you know that?" I told him as I left. He just smiled, speaking into his phone. "Please calm down. Nothing has changed. We own him, and he knows it." I lingered by the door to listen in, but he had already hung up. Both of my parents were fired on the same day. Neither were given more than a superficial reason. I suppose I should be thankful that it wasn't Mr. Bryce, the serial killer, that visited them instead. I had gotten so used to his ubiquitous presence that I never really stopped to think how much power he had over me. Over everyone. I fantasized about trying to kill him for a while, but immediately thought of Mr. Bryce the policeman, and Mr. Bryce the judge who would find me wherever I went. The mood was really dark around my house for the next few days, until I received a full academic scholarship in the mail. Considering their recent terminations, my parents made it very clear that they wouldn't be able to help me with my tuition. They told me I'd be an idiot not to accept it, and of course they were right. It didn't seem like a bad life that he had planned for me. I was being handed opportunities that other people could only dream of. But it wasn't my life. If I just gave up without a fight, then who knows where it would end. Maybe he wanted to use me to build a new bomb or design a weaponized virus. If I gave in to him now, then I'd be surrendering my whole life to him. Trying to confront him again seemed too dangerous. But whoever he kept talking to on the phone must know what's going on. I just had to steal it and see who he called while I was being fired. This wasn't exactly a simple matter. I couldn't break into his house because he could be anyone or anywhere. I had to lure him to me, and that meant doing something which threatened to destroy his plans for me. As long as he controlled the situation, it seemed like any criminal offense or outrageous act could be covered up by the people in power he posed as. It was overwhelming how powerless I felt. But with or without him, I could never control how other people acted. I just had to focus on myself, the one thing he couldn't take away. I chose the top of the bank for this purpose. I was able to climb up pretty easily because of the adjoining buildings, and it had a nice flat roof that was high enough to do some real damage if I jumped. I stood up there for a long while, watching a street so familiar and mundane, yet surreal and incomprehensible, that I felt like an alien. As the wind whipped around me, I wondered whether I would still jump if he didn't show up to stop me. Would my death be a victory over him? Or was it the inevitable conclusion that he had always led me towards? A hand on my shoulder meant I never had to find out. "Took you long enough," I said without turning. I stiffened my shoulder under his grip. I wanted my tension to be obvious. I wanted him to really believe I would do it. "It's a hard climb for someone my age. Couldn't you have found something a little lower to jump from?" I could almost hear the wink in his voice. His hand tightened slightly, but I pulled away, the toe of my shoe now over the edge. "I'm not here to negotiate. I want you out of my life." There was a long silence. I glanced behind me. He was dialing his cell phone. Hello. "I'm having a bit of a pickle here," he said into the phone. I didn't waste my chance. Pinning his free hand against my body, I spun around to snatch the phone from him. He lurched back, but I dove after him. A quick spin as he tried to shield the phone with his torso, hands buffeting each other out of the way. Then another lunge and I had the phone. I wrapped my whole body against it, hurling myself to the ground to protect it. His arm was still tangled up in mine, though. And with a turn, he slipped straight out into the open air. Those few seconds watching him tumble were the longest of my life. I turned away before he hit the ground, but I still heard the sickening crack.
Who's there? What's going on?
The voice in the phone. My voice. Strained and weary, muffled and distorted. But it was unmistakably mine. I didn't have time to decipher this. I couldn't decipher much of anything, aside from the fact that the world was coming to an end. A man collapsed in the street, causing a small turbulence of panic around him. Then a second, and a third. Everyone crumpling into discarded bags of meat. The buildings were dissolving into so much dust, and the light of the sky bled and ran like watercolor. A moment later, and the building beneath my feet gave way, and tumbling into blackness, I awoke on a narrow cot, holding a phone in my hand. I tried to jerk upright, immediately regretting my decision as my tethered IV lines dragged inside my veins. "A few more years and we would have had a cure." Mr. Bryce's voice. But not Mr. Bryce. The thing over my bed was more akin to the dissolving world I had just witnessed than any human being I had ever seen. Skin in constant dissolution, warping and reforming before my eyes. Am I dreaming? I asked. "Not anymore." "You did this to me?" "I simply spun the dream. A dream about the life you could have lived. And if you were to discover a cure inside that dream, you'd wake up and still remember it. You'd be able to get better again. But now..." I couldn't look up at the creature. I turned away to look down the length of my body. My emaciated arms, the outlines of my knees as sharp blades beneath my blanket. That was even worse. I'm not writing this as a warning. There isn't a lesson here. Although perhaps there is some merit in trusting one's dreams, no matter how outlandish. No threats or looming dread. I'm simply sharing my story because the dream spinner has left me. I'm alone and angry at myself. And I'm so frightened. I'm going back to sleep in the chance that I dream again. But if I do not wake, then I suppose what I'm really writing this for is simply to say goodbye. I've been told this is the place to post mysterious stuff and to get answers. Which is good because answers are what I need right now. So I live in one of those older suburban developments outside of Toronto. You know, the ones they built up in the 70s for the poorer people to move into. I've lived at that house for my entire life, and yes, that includes my childhood. Growing up in the early 2000s with rather frugal parents, my childhood memories were of watching movies on VHS, playing games on Windows XP, and so on. Of the many movies I remember watching as a young boy, one of them was certainly not Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls. I discovered the obscure film when I was cleaning out the basement. My parents had moved out some time ago and left me the old house. They wanted me to make one last check for anything they might want to bring to their new house. When I was searching the basement, I found a box in the corner of the room labeled Kids Movies. I opened it and began to look at some of the VHS tapes. Most of them I had fond memories of. VeggieTales, Peter Pan, the Berenstain Bears. Some I just found weird as a child, like those obscure Christian films like Bible Man. Out of all these tapes, only one really stuck out to me as unfamiliar. The aforementioned Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls. According to the back of the case, it was made in 1992 by a Canadian film studio called Funbox Entertainment. Odd. Most of the cassettes I had were from the late 90s, around the time my older brother was born. Intrigued, I read the synopsis. From the studio that brought you Frankie Pig's Big Adventure, Canada's favorite farm friend is back in a feature-length adventure. When Farmer Casey lets the farm animals go on vacation, troublemaking Frankie Pig decides to jump ship in Niagara Falls, making friends and learning lessons as he tries to find Farmer Casey and the others. Alright. Sounds innocent enough, I thought to myself. Fortunately, I keep a VCR in the house in case I ever want to feel nostalgic. So I decided to find out what I was missing and loaded the tape into the machine. So first, it starts with the production company logo shining on the screen to that generic sort of synth music. Then another logo for a different company that did the distribution, called Kidscape Distribution Canada. After the logos, the film began with, surprisingly enough, a live-action sequence. Here on the live-action, but obviously cheaply made farm, we were all introduced to Farmer Casey, a friendly country gal who runs Fiddlesticks Farm. She loudly announces to the camera that she's taking the animals on a vacation, and you, the viewer, needs to help her wake them up. One by one, very slowly, we are introduced to the animated animals. Cassidy the cow, Elizabeth the horse, Larry the chicken, and Quincy the duck. But where's Frankie? Given what we know from the synopsis, the pig was up to no good. So Farmer Casey once again gives us, the viewer, the all-important duty of finding Frankie. And of course we do. He's hiding in the mud, silly pig. Now it's time for Farmer Casey to load the trailer and to disembark on our vacation. We make a few stops at some Canadian landmarks, where we then learn some basic information at each stop. Then, Frankie turns to the camera and tells us he's ditching the crew when we arrive to Niagara Falls because that farmer lady is just so boring. So we too join Frankie when he hops off the trailer when nobody's looking. And that's when everything changes. Immediately, the friendly-looking Frankie switches from a cute little pig with a hat to a real man. with a distorted pig mask, and the camera quality became significantly distorted. I paused the tape. What the heck? I said to myself. I stopped watching for a little bit to do some research. I needed to find out what the hell this film was about. So I Googled it. Frankie Pig visits Niagara Falls. Nothing popped up. Nothing relevant anyway. Most of it was just some pictures of pigs on Instagram or something, some of which who happened to be named Frankie. So I then decided to look up the production company, Funbox Entertainment. Immediately I was presented with their website, so I clicked on it. The website was so obviously dated, with crappy vector graphics and pixelated GIFs of various animated characters, and the company motto, creating Canada's premier animation since 1972. There was a link to see all the movies they ever produced, and guess what? No mention of Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls, or Frankie Pig at all, for that matter. The most recent film they're credited with is an animated kids film, their specialty, entitled Horace's Lonely Island, made in 1991. However, there was a number to call at the bottom, so I did. No response. So I decided that before I did any more research, I would finish the film. I sat back down on the couch and pressed play. This new, creepy version retained the original childish voice of Frankie, except now it seemed like he was crying as he spoke, like he was forced to say the words. "Now that I've left those fools, it's time to explore," said Frankie. He was standing in a field, very obviously not a set. The camera turned to showcase the skyline of Niagara Falls, lit with nightlights. The film quality made it feel like those creepy found footage films on YouTube somewhere. The camera was behind Frankie, following him as we slowly walked towards the city. The film cut to Clifton Hill. It's practically midnight judging from the sky, and the lights of the strip are the only things cutting through the darkness. Frankie walks up the street, past several tour buses and tourists, none of whom seem to notice him. It's when he turns onto a side street when I notice he's holding something. A knife. A woman, dressed similarly to Farmer Casey, is standing at the end of the alley. When she turns around, her face is disfigured. "Frankie, you naughty pig, I thought I'd never find you," she hollered. The way she said it was eerie. Then, 4 men wearing animal masks appear behind her, and Frankie walks up to her. "I knew I'd find you, farmer lady," the child said on the other side of the microphone. Suddenly, the screen went static, and the camera cut to the film set at the farm. There, the 5 men brutally stabbed the actress who was playing Farmer Casey, while a young boy, who I think is the voice actor who played Frankie, watched. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Why would my parents even have this? I decided to stop watching again. What's the story of this strange film? There had to be some sort of explanation. So I did some more digging on the company, Funbox Entertainment. Turns out they declared bankruptcy in 1994 because they hadn't made money since '92, the same year Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls supposedly came out. Other than that, nothing was that out of the ordinary, just business stuff. Obviously, I was missing something. The opening credits mentioned another company, Kidscape Distribution Canada, the people who distributed the film to retailers. A quick search for them turned up their website, which showed that they were still distributing films. A phone number was provided here, so I called. The following is a rough transcription of what took place.
Hello, this is Chris from Kidscape Distribution of Greater Toronto. How may I help you today?
Hey Chris, I'd like to ask you some questions about one of the films you distributed.
Of course, which one?
It's this old VHS kids cartoon. I think it's called Frankie Pig Visits Niagara Falls.
Oh shit. I haven't heard of that one. If you leave your name and information, I'll get back to you when I can.
Alright. I gave him my name and address before hanging up. The information I left him was fake, by the way. The way he acted over the phone was a bit too suspicious for my taste. Soon after, I went back to the tape and watched further. After the gruesome scene on set was finished, the scene jumped back to Niagara Falls, where the animals are now carrying the other woman who is dressed as Farmer Casey. They walk her back onto Clifton Hill when police lights begin to flare. Again, the camera cuts to a scene of the falls at daytime, and all seems normal until a hand appears in front of the camera, giving a thumbs up. Then, the body of the other woman is seen, being thrown into the falls. The camera is then spun around to reveal more establishing shots of the city, before a man starts singing children's nursery rhymes. It then resumes to the animated children's film I thought I would be watching. Frankie begins to regret leaving the other animals, and begins to take action to find Farmer Casey and the gang, while also learning about the history and significance of the city of Niagara Falls. Then the credits begin to roll, and this is when I got my notebook out. First and foremost, I needed to find out if the actor who portrayed Farmer Casey was ever murdered, the actor who portrayed Frankie was ever kidnapped, and if the director or someone at the studio ever got caught. But to my surprise, all of the names were cut out of the credits. This is when I went to the police. I drove over to the station and handed in the VHS and told them everything I knew. They told me they would do everything in their power to find out the meaning of this tape. So that's it, you're thinking. That's all. No, that's not all. Before I posted this, something came up on the news. Remember the fake address I gave to the distribution company? Yesterday, there was a fire at that very location. A fire the police suspect to be arson. I think I'm onto something here. If any of you out there have ever seen this movie, or know something about it, or have even worked on it, please tell me about it. I need to know everything about this film. Is it just my copy that's like this? Do the events on the film correlate to anything in Niagara Falls? Please, I just need to find some answers.